Ei, Sachsenhausen, Kolonia Gwarna, Parna, Germania richtig dicker Heil, Sachsenhausen. Birdycie jak bambusik, trupie łebki to kaktusy heil. Es lebe Kultur Kampf.
Germans erased my family so perfectly that I have no sense of self, no sense of ancestry, no history. The power of us just standing in these footprints made us feel not so erased.
Welcome to Descendant Stuff, a podcast by and for the descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners, working together to uncover the unanswered questions of its history. We are Jakob, Nicole, and Kelsey, three descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners. Today, we're talking about Max Feybusch, who is a 61-year-old merchant living in Wilhelmshaven, Germany, when he was arrested in the June 1938 nationwide raid against so-called asocials and brought to Sachsenhausen. He managed to live 1 year, 7 months before dying of so-called physical weakness at the camp. Today, we are with Julie Summers, a descendant of Max who is researching and piecing together stories about Max's life before, during, and after Sachsenhausen. Can you tell us about your relation to Max, Julie?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for including me in a podcast to bring to light the life of Max. Max was my grandfather's brother. My grandfather was one of 8 siblings, and Max was the oldest.
What do you know about his life before Sachsenhausen?
Our history of these siblings that I'm referring to, including my grandfather, was non-existent for a long time. My grandfather died when my mom was a teenager, and there are virtually no stories about even my grandfather. He wasn't really spoken of. And we have a few stories. We have a strong history of being an engineer and making many patents. And some of these patents are still used today. And some of them are kind of famous patents. So we have that kind of history about my grandfather, but nothing about his family. So they were effectively erased from any kind of knowledge. And I'd like to say my history about my Feybusch family is a history of boxes, because things were stored away in boxes that just accidentally were discovered. So I one day got a box in the mail from my cousin who sent me paraphernalia from her mother. And in the box was a poem that my grandfather wrote about his brother Max. And it was a very long narrative poem for his wedding, for Max's wedding. And it had chapters to it, many, many chapters that spanned from Max's childhood all the way up until the day he was getting married. And it was in German, Old German, and so the language was difficult to have anybody decipher or translate, much less read, because it was typed up in very fancy old-style German. So it took us like a year of trying to find anybody to help us with that translation. And in that translation, we did discover relatives that he mentioned that were lost. And in that translation, we realized that the family was very assimilated. They celebrated Shabbat with a funny story of Max peeing on the grandmother during Shabbat candle lighting. It was the first funny story that was told in Max's story.
At what age was he peeing on the grandmother?
As an infant. Thank you. The golden infant. who was placed on the grandmother's lap, who was just adoring over this golden child, and blessing how lucky she was in life to have this child in her lap. And then she was getting warmer and warmer and thought, oh, the candlelight and the glow and the evening services at the table were so warm and wonderful, until she suddenly realized the reason why she was warm was because he was peeing in her lap. So she soundly put Max down onto the floor and returned him to his parents. But Max seemed to be a little bit of a troublemaker. Like, he was a very fun character to read about, and there were some very good stories about him. And the next story, if you might, can I go on with the story about the trouble he would get into? The next story is he had a slingshot, and he was very good with it. He was all around the town shooting things, shooting at horses, shooting at policemen, shooting top hats off of people. He just found a lot of glee with the slingshot. And there's a story about at Christmas time, the family set up the Christmas tree, and they put all the garlands around the bottom of the tree and candy at the top. So you're envisioning this Jewish family with a great big tree of 8 children all around, and you're trying to understand why was there a Christmas tree after we segued from Shabbat. But the parents left the room after they feel like the tree was decorated well, and Max went and got his slingshot and started shooting down all the candy from the top of the tree, which is what the kids really cared about as opposed to the garlands. And so he was a favorite among the siblings because he took care of them in that regard. But then he climbed the ladder to having a pop gun and then having fireworks, which at one time he cleared his father's store completely because he set up a whole string of fireworks outside the courtyard, and everybody ran for safety. And Max ran very far away to hide and not to be found. But there's many stories that really made Max endearing to all of us who read his story, and it gave us a window into our Jewish family that we knew nothing about. And although I know I'm Jewish by my DNA, I know I'm Jewish because that's what I've been told, that I'm Jewish. I was not raised Jewish. There was no one around me who was Jewish in the family. And so it was really settling to find family that told me about who I was, where before I knew nothing. I was just in a very tight, small family with no other reference to where I came from. And so with that, we started opening Ancestry.com and looking for these siblings that were referred to in this poem that we received in this box. Another box of clues was we suddenly found a box of postcards my mother had saved because she had a postcard collection. And in going through this box of postcards that were suddenly found were many postcards, again in German, that were from these siblings to my grandfather. And these postcards, somebody sat and spent literally a year translating them for me. So these were 100. The wedding story was 125 years old. How that survived through all these ages, I don't know. This is the original transcript from the wedding poem. And these postcards are 100 years old. Some of them were written in pencil, and upside down and across, and they put so much writing into a little tiny postcard. It is amazing that this person was able to translate and read these postcards. And what was interesting is we were then introduced to the lives of these siblings. They came to life for us. They were vibrant. Some of them were funny. They were all very clever. They were business people. They went to the races. One of them would write upside down. He would write from the bottom up and from the right to the left, right? Was it? I think. But so it was hard to translate because half of his postcards you had to read in a different way. And apparently that's very common, I guess, from people who are left-handed, or it's common that they think that way. So half the time they might write upside down and backwards. And some of the time they write regular way. But you always had to figure out where he was starting on the postcard to even understand. And there was another brother who was always short, but very funny. And he always signed, his name was Julius, but he always signed it Gulaga. Why Gulaga? We don't know, but it sounds like he was the youngest of the family. And it sounded like it was probably, he couldn't say his name. And it's a bunch of kids all running around. And he just... that must have been his nickname and he wrote it with such big flourish and emphasis. So these are the family members that we were excited about meeting because not only do we discover they're there and we have a rich history, and then we discover who they were and can laugh at the idiosyncratic ways of writing or their idiosyncrasies. One we called Thank God. He was actually called Thank God because he renounced his Judaism, married somebody who was Christian. And so I guess he embraced it. So he would say thank God all out throughout the postcard. So everything was thank God. So, we are doing fine, thank God. And I hope you are doing fine yourself, thank God. And so there was a lot of thank Gods, and even friends who wrote about that sibling would call him thank God.
It might even be connected to his past of being Jewish, too, because a lot of Jewish people speak like that. It's a very common response to the question, how are you? Just to respond, thank God. So, yeah.
I do not know. Thank you for that insight. We're welcoming any kind of insight.
I have neighbors who respond like that. When I ask them, how are you? They just say, thank God. They don't even say, fine, thank God. They just, it's in Hebrew, Baruch Hashem. So that's a lot. You got so much information from this poem about the individuals in that family that you didn't, before you had the poem, you didn't know that they existed.
Correct.
You started with these little tidbits, this poem and these postcards. And so for a family you didn't know existed, now you know names, you know even parts of their personality, you know some stories about things that have happened in their past.
And we can laugh. And who gets that insert? And as the person who was translating the postcards, she said, this is like text messages. These are like text messages for today, only they're written down. And that's exactly what it was. And then as we slowly progressed with our ancestry knowledge, we began realizing the fate of these siblings. And then that was very difficult to integrate. And it was very hard to get full stories because we're here in America and I am reading in German and having to translate all the ancestry from that we're getting. And we don't have the same access as you would if you were German to these documents. But as we're scratching through the ancestry, we realized all of a sudden there was somebody in Germany that had the same information on our family, and they had pictures. We wrote to this person, and there was no answer.
Somebody who's living today.
Yes. We wrote to this person and said, hey, we think we're related. We think you have pictures of our family, because we had none. And there was no response. And another year went by, and we wrote again and said, nudged them again, and no response. And February of this year, all of a sudden, we decided this person was probably older and maybe set up a ancestry account and then maybe passed away. And we were giving up any hope of ever hearing from this person. And then suddenly in February, there was this dump of pictures that all these pictures, all these siblings that we only envisioned what they looked like, suddenly turned alive. There were pictures of these ancestors. There was a picture of Max. There was a picture of Gulaga, aka Julius. I mean, there's just tears, just tears of joy. And we wrote to this person and said, who are you? We're related. who is your grandparent? And so she stayed connected with us, thankfully, because I felt like this was somebody who was very shy to want to connect with us. It's taken her over 2 years to even write. And later on, she said, "You asked the right questions. You were very careful with your questions. I did not respond to you because I just did not want to be talking with somebody who was foolish or stupid." She actually said the word stupid, but I think what she meant was she didn't want someone coming across who was going to ask a bunch of questions that didn't have deep meaning. And she had, on her own, discovered all these 8 siblings. My grandfather happened to be the favorite brother. The one that went to America was considered the favorite brother. And she was wanting to know so much about my grandfather and was so excited to hear and talk to us. But she, on her own, had tracked down the fates of all these siblings and their children, and to the tune, and wrote chapters on them to the tune of, 10 to 20 pages on each one.
Did she write these chapters about Max as well?
Max was the only one that she did not write a whole chapter on. I and my daughter knew more about Max than she did. Because for some reason we were able to find more about Max. But her words in her first chapter were, "There is no one to share this information with. I don't know who these people are and what their lives were like. And there is no one to share these chapters with and no one to help me know any more about these people." And it was a very sad closing to her first chapter because you could sense that she was very, very alone with her knowledge, and that this knowledge was very heavy on her shoulders, and that it was extremely private to her. So we come along and are excited because we have so many stories, and we're able to reveal to her who these people were. And we could share the stories. So we had one side of the story and she had the other side of the story. So it was a sense of joy and relief to her to share this information. I would scan a postcard once or twice a week and I would send it to her, and we would hypercritical analyze what that postcard meant. She would give us a German interpretation and a German slant on it so we could understand a little bit better what we were reading. And her story was her grandmother was my grandfather's sister, and her grandmother's husband was on the board of Mercedes-Benz. It was well known that he was married to a Jew, and so he was removed from the board of Mercedes. And she, in essence, had to have a very, very low profile because everybody knew there was a Jew in Berlin, and at any time she could be sent away. And indeed, she did get her transport papers at the very end when they were scooping up all the
mixed race marriages. Like she was in a mixed race marriage, so it was in order to round up anyone left in those relationships.
And I think they were trying to respect, his position in the company. They sent her husband to Russia, I believe, and he was in charge of forced labor and doing munitions, building ammunition for Mercedes, for the company. So here she was trying to lay low while her husband was doing forced labor with the Jews. So it was a very difficult family dynamic. They were very much in love, very close. It was a very wonderful marriage and continued on. But she had her transport papers, and then just a few days before she was to be transported, we think, to Auschwitz, she had some kind of heart problem, and they said, "That's all right. It's enough of a heart problem. We're not going to transport you." And that's why she was able to live, but she was silent for the rest of her life about anything about being Jewish. You were told in this cousin's family, we're told to just be good, but be quiet. because if you weren't quiet, they might take you away. So to be Jewish was not to be talked about. And when her grandparents died and passed away, and she was going through her grandparents' belongings, she found a box. So here's our third box, a box of postcards, a box of writings, and the last is a box that were pictures of her Jewish ancestors. And she went on and from these pictures, with whatever few notations were on the back, she pieced out who was who in the family. And that is how we were able, because she's like a detective, she was able to put a face to all these relatives. 6 of them were erased in the Holocaust, and their children. So let's go back to Max. And he was a very early arrest. And as you said, he was arrested back in June of 1938. He had in 1905, that's a 33-year-old arrest, where he was arrested and sentenced to 3 months in prison because of some fraudulent
Forgery.
of his part in his business dealings. I think he ran on some hard times. He was newlywed, had a new son. That's how he handled trying to make his way forward. I mean, when he died, he was a businessman that was managing 4 businesses international business. So he overcame that hump, whatever it was, and then was successful in the business world. When he was arrested, his wife, who was not Jewish, made a claim for his belongings and for restitution. She made a claim for his gold glasses, his silk underwear, his gold pocket watch, and his silk shirt. So obviously he was very well-to-do. I don't know why at the end of the war she thought they would retain his silk underwear, but we found very humorous in that aspect. We are assuming that based on that criminal record, that is why they decided to arrest Max as an asocial.
So this goes to his life before Sachsenhausen and painting this picture of this businessman who was a former rambunctious child who knew how to get into trouble and get out of trouble. Also, as an adult, a young adult, got into trouble for forgery and served time. But what got him into Sachsenhausen was not necessarily a crime that he had done at the time. It was his prior criminal record made him somebody who the Nazis wanted to round up in the 1938 so-called asocial decree. There was a quota to bring in people, recruit people who had a prior criminal record and or were Jewish. Is that correct?
It's a wonderful summary of what I was saying. Thank you. And I think also he probably had a very high profile in the town. From where he lived, it was right there on the harbor. I would think he had a very high profile as a business person. He was a large individual in terms of who he was and how, as you said, he lived his life. And just by the belongings he had on him when he was arrested, it was obvious he stood out in a crowd.
What do you know about his time in Sachsenhausen?
Oh, that is so frustrating. We have tried. It was a lot of work for us, again, being in the United States, to get any information and know how to negotiate any authorities and any organizations to try to get information. We do know that, he was there for 1 year and 7 months. And so we knew his day of death and the reason why he died, which was physical weakness and fatigue. But we knew nothing of his time at Sachsenhausen. We wrote to Sachsenhausen and asked for any records they had, and they had those status reports every year. So we had one from the day he came in, one from that next year, and then one that he had died. But other than that, there was it did not provide us with any information. We knew he lived in a certain block. It was Block 40. And can't say he lived his whole time in Block 40, but in the records that they had, he lived in Block 40. Yes, Block 40 was in the small camp. But from my understanding, just recently, when we went to Sachsenhausen in September, one of the authorities said at that time, originally Block 40 didn't exist. They had to
Block 40
build
is in
Block
the
40.
small camp?
So I don't know where his first place of residence was necessarily, but when Block 40 and they sectioned off the Jews into the small camp, that's where he was. He spent most of his time there. And our big question is, it seems like a year and 7 months at Sachsenhausen, we're very curious about why he was able to live that long, considering the treatment of the Jews at the very bottom of the social ladder. And we're very curious as to how he could live this long. He was 61 years old. So we have a lot of questions about his life and what his responsibility was while he was in Sachsenhausen. We would love to hear more. I understand that the Jews were treated very poorly, and I don't know. He was registered as a Protestant when he was arrested, as many of his siblings were, but that did not stop this family from still being arrested and still being sent to the various death camps or concentration camps. His work duty was not severe enough. The time he died, which was in January of 1940, that was a very specific date where a lot of people were killed at Sachsenhausen. It was a very cold winter with snow on the ground, sub-freezing, and there were a lot of sick and languishing people at camp. And apparently, the camp was being run by Haas. I hope I'm saying the name correctly. Exactly. And apparently, Himmel, thank you for correcting my very bad German and my horrible sense of being able to pronounce their names. But he came through and said, you've got too many people sick and hanging around, do something about it. And so
Rudolf
Haas had everybody stand
Heinrich Himmler.
at attention in the center of the camp overnight, for all day and overnight. And those people that fell were just taken away. And 800 prisoners died in that standoff. And House was reinforced for doing such an excellent job of killing so many people and ridding his camp of all the sick people that he was then transferred to Auschwitz to set up a very effective killing mechanism at Auschwitz, which we all know he did that. But this first step that he took of lining everybody up was the first step to show his force and his ability to rise above sympathy for the prisoners.
And are you saying that that's the context for Max, like in his story?
I am saying it's the context of the weather, of the people around him who were very sick. But luckily, Max died 2 days before having to stand out in the cold, in the weather.
So it was during that time in the winter of 1940, Max had been living for 1 year, 7 months in the camp, somehow as a 63-year-old. And at the time, we know that there was both tuberculosis and scarlet fever running through the camp and made many, many people sick in an unusually cold winter. And so at that time, also
with clothes that were more geared towards summer, they weren't necessarily the warm clothes that you might think.
So in this context, in those circumstances, Max ended up just dying of what is labeled physical weakness. And then a few days later, So many people were weak that Hoss ended up creating a way to kill off a whole bunch of people to end that unnecessary maintenance of people. And that's the context in which Max died.
And apparently a lot of them hid out in the latrines of the barracks. So I think that was contributing to the spread of sickness. So it was their way of just finalizing that. So I don't know if Max was one of the ones that were languishing in the latrines or out working when he died of fatigue. But definitely the cold weather was a contributing factor to. And that's it. I don't know. I'm looking for any other stories. I am excited that there's a way that somebody's building a way that descendants with this podcast, that descendants can connect with other descendants to even hear a story. Like, I want to find other people of maybe descendants where their family member survived Sachsenhausen so that they can tell me a story about the living conditions, help open up clues that were more personal stories that will give us more ideas.
Like, if this podcast is for and by descendants of Sachsenhausen, like, do you have a specific wonder or question that you would want to put to the group of other people who get interviewed after you?
Yeah, I guess I could connect with other people that had stories from their descendants from Block 40. The block makes a difference to me, you know, where they were, because I don't think they were able to interact beyond their barrack necessarily.
We do know from the autobiography, or, you know, like the self-told story of Harry Neujoks. It's a publication in German only, not in English, but he does give a specific story about a Jewish prisoner showing up at his barrack and standing outside the door. And Neujoks says, we couldn't let him in. I couldn't talk to him in the open because if we were caught, the Jewish prisoner would have been killed and I would have received 25 lashings over that torture device, the wooden bench that you have to be strapped to and caned with a cane or beaten with lashings. And so there was a penalty for even having Jewish people talk to others. So we know things like he would have been in extreme isolation as a Jewish person from anyone else in the rest of the camp.
The one story that gave me a little bit of hope was one of the descendants that I met at the memorial in September was a descendant of one of the Czech students that were arrested, that 1,000 Czech students were arrested. Was it in 1939, I believe it was, yeah. And they suddenly had to integrate these 1,000 Czech students. And I don't think they were ready for the influx of all these students. And the students were arrested not because they were protesting, but because they wanted to make sure that they don't protest. Because in northern Czechoslovakia, they allowed Germany to be responsible for northern Czechoslovakia. And that's why they would come in and swoop up the students to make sure they did not protest against this new government. So this one descendant, his grandfather was put into Barrack 40. And his story was that all these students were very merry. They were young students. They all sang. They sang good songs. They were just all musicians, or, well, not musicians as much as they did a lot of singing of all different kinds. And that his ancestor probably brought a lot of merriment to Barrack 40 while they're there. I don't know how much merriment you would have there with it, but he wanted to assure me that the Czech students were a lively bunch, a rowdy bunch, and during the time that they were in that barrack, they would have added a lot of levity. But I don't know if the Jewish prisoners were allowed to talk to them. Were they separated in the barrack some way? I don't know.
Well, we do know some corroboration that from records that the small camp, as in the Jewish camp of Barrack 38, 39, 40, that there's a record of that also being the quarantine barrack for when incomers needed to temporarily be placed somewhere. And also it was a space not just for quarantine of holding Penn, but quarantine for people who were ill. And I believe there was scarlet fever. There's a case of going around of scarlet fever in the Czech students. So it seems like there's also evidence that would support the reason why those students would be mixed in with the subcamp.
And the Czech students were told they were to be held there for 3 years. But many had powerful parents because they were students and they probably had some resources. They were able to slowly pull a lot of the students out and return them to their homes. But in the case of his grandfather, they didn't have a lot of resources. So his grandfather had to stay the entire 3 years. But after a certain amount of time, he was transferred out of Barrack 40.
And that's how he got to survive and end up telling the story to you, right?
Yes, it was a very important story to me because it was the first person I talked to that had a story in Barrack 40, any story.
And it's kind of remarkable to think this is not a Jewish person. It's not an asocial person. Regardless of people's background of how they got into Sachsenhausen, that there's so much in common. A descendant of a Jewish asocial prisoner ends up having so much in common with a descendant of a Czech student who happened to be in the same place at the same time.
It really was profound. And when I was telling this other attendee, his grandfather was just a student, and he did nothing. The person turned to me and said, well, neither did your grandfather. It actually made me tear up because I just thought, well, we were Jewish. So that means that there was such a stigma that it's hard to erase that we did something wrong. You always feel like you did something wrong because you were Jewish. And I had been programmed to think we as Jews, there's something wrong, that we did something wrong. So, of course, we have this status. And I think it was so nice to hear somebody say, but you didn't do anything. Your grandparent didn't do anything wrong either. To be there. I couldn't talk after that. Probably he didn't realize how important his words were to me. It just stopped me to think I really have, after all these years, have framed my ancestors and my heritage. I've been programmed to do that in a negative light. We took a picture of us standing. It's a really powerful picture of the walls of the camp. I have a picture that I took, and then all of us who were in a barrack and knew where our family members had lived while at Sachsenhausen, we all stood in the footprint of our barracks, standing next to this descendant of a Czech student, just standing in the footprint, in the stone bed of the footprint of the barrack. Next to him with another person, and next to us was another barrack with another person standing, and behind us was another footprint with another person standing. And the power of us just standing in these footprints made us feel not so erased, because there was such a sense of erasure with my family. Germans erased my family so perfectly that I have no sense of self, no sense of ancestry, no history. And it's taken just these ridiculous found boxes that happen to find our way so oddly that any one of those things could have been thrown away as not important to connect and put me in Sachsenhausen this fall. Any one of those boxes, if they had been thrown away in the trash or thrown away because it was too much effort to send them to me, to give them to me, and also for my cousin, I would know nothing and I would not have a story. Astrid wrote a book about Sachsenhausen, and she's the Astrid
Lai, the lead researcher at Sachsenhausen Memorial and was the interim director of Sachsenhausen Memorial.
She wrote a book that came just in English. I was talking to her, asked to hire her to help me find more about the asocials that were living there and how possibly some clues of how this young 60-year-old person could have survived. Like what Where could he have possibly worked that didn't destroy him earlier? So I had her book in my hand, and I also said, could I pay you to spend time with us just to help me understand a little bit more about what could possibly have extended his life there? And she said, you can't pay me. There is no payment. We don't accept payment. This is part of what we owe you. And she gave me the book, and I'm sorry. And I said, can I pay you for the book? And her words were, you've paid enough. And those are the other set of words that I'll always carry, that I've paid enough. And I didn't think as an ancestor, that's just, 2 generations down from what all the prisoners suffered at this memorial, at this camp. I did not realize how much this intergenerational trauma is carried. You would think that these 3 Gs, is what we're called, would be not as emotionally tied to what happened. When I look at my cousin and the weight she carries and carried for so long, all by herself, with no one to share them with, the sense of aloneness that she's always had. We now talk every day. We write every day. There's such a relief to finally have one relative that has a shared sense of loss, that it's very difficult to understand the trauma that has gone on and continues to go on. And I know that my daughter has the same sense of trauma, and my granddaughter is very tied to continuing to tell the story. One of Max's children, if I can divert to not just Sachsenhausen, Max had 2 sons. One who was married, he and his wife were murdered in Auschwitz. His other son, who was married again to someone who wasn't Jewish and had a child, escaped on the
Kristallnacht in November
Yes.
of 1938.
Yes. And he was able to escape to Panama. And he lived in Panama for several years. His wife was able to finally get out. And with the son, I think they panhandled. They were very connected to a synagogue in Panama City that was helping other Jews trying to find ways to get out and give them assistance, even in Central and South America. And then there was arrests being made, and we now found him on a ship to America. They arrested people, all the Japanese, all the Jews, and many of the Germans in Central and South America to avoid having them rise up or spy on America, but they reached into Central and South America to arrest people.
Who is they?
The American government.
So the American government preventatively arrested people in South America to prevent them from rising up?
Mm-hmm. And they put this family member into camps. There were German camps all over America.
The German camp, you mean it's the Americans creating camps to contain German citizens?
Correct. Americans are very well aware of the Japanese camps that were set up all across America, but they are not aware that there were also German containment camps and that they put the Jews in with their persecutors, which were the Germans, which were very hard to understand. And they moved them around. They took away their papers. So that's why they could kind of call them prisoners, because there were no papers, because they stripped them of their papers. And then they separated. The women went to one camp. One was in Florida. The other one was in, say, Louisiana. And they were moved around quite a bit until they were finally put in the same camp. I think this son of Max finally was released as somebody that the American government had to follow the next year after the end of the war. So he lived under this Enemy Alienation Act for a very long time.
In the United States.
In the United States.
This is the son of Max.
Mm-hmm. So again, that family stayed in America and had children, but they are unreachable. They definitely did not follow any Judaism. I think everybody was raised Catholic. I did send them Max's poem, and the one family member that is, say, my age, the third generation, I sent him the poem of Max and didn't ask anything of him. I just said, here, I think you should know was the life of your ancestor, which was very rich. I was hoping he maybe would think to want to reach out to me, but it's been very quiet. I was sad that he was very clear about erasing any contact with any ancestors at all. And you can understand the trauma that that family went through to escape and then yet be arrested a second time. We in the United States don't know that story. And that's a story that needs to be told as well with the Enemy Alienation Act, which has been brought into the forefront again with this changing administration and the political profile in America right now. They throw around the Enemy Alienation Act, and it's too close to my heart. So it's very scary to me what's going on politically and also what's going on politically in Germany at the time.
Like currently, what you're seeing, the story that you've just recently uncovered of all these family members and what happened to them that had been lost or disappeared, and then you are finding it again, and it feels like you feel maybe rich in the information you discovered, but you're also understanding how closely it ties to what's happening today.
You can say it to people, but they don't get it. They don't understand the context.
If this podcast is for and by descendants of Sachsenhausen, is there anything that you would want to say or share to any future interviewees, or any wisdom or insights that you've had that you would like to sign off with?
I would say, please communicate. Please stay connected. Please know there's so many people that are looking for answers because they have nothing else to go on except a name. I know how much time it's taken our family to dig and find answers. And in some ways, people ask, why do you want to know? I mean, the only thing you're going to find is not very pleasant information, but it's an answer. It's an answer to understanding something about that relative. When we went to the memorial conference in September, they asked to bring something that meant something to us about that family member. Until I met this cousin who gave me a picture, all I had was a poem. I didn't have anything about him at all except for this poem to offer up, and one postcard that he had written to my grandfather. So I came with a postcard which shows me his handwriting. I came with, a poem, and I was able to have one picture. Those were riches compared to other people in our group who actually were frustrated with the request to bring something, because they had so much of nothing except for a name. And the frustration is so palpable, even to this third generation and fourth generation of people lost. It's just important to know something. I still grapple with the fact, am I Jewish or not Jewish? I know that has nothing to do with this, all the reasons that a lot of the people, all the political prisoners that were at Sachsenhausen, but obviously, Max was persecuted because he was Jewish. And I need to find somewhere in my sense of self what that all means. So where before I had no sense of grounding, now I feel like I do. I have relatives. I have a history. I have a story. I have characters that were wonderful and funny and so alive to me that when I read the story about Max's childhood and the poem, the narrative story to my grandchild, she got so excited and said, where do we meet him? I love this guy. And I'm going, I know, we all love this guy. She goes, yeah, where is he? Like, when can we meet him? And then I had to give her the news of, his fate. But the point was, Max was alive. And I don't want to talk about his death as much as I want to talk about his life. I want to know what his life was about, even to the very end. I don't know if that's a good wrap up or not.
It sounds like what you're asking to pass on to other descendants is like, please share, because what we do share is so helpful to others. And even though our personal stories of each prisoner is really distinct and might not be the same background as anyone else, whatever we do share, we descendants, whatever we can find and share for our own backgrounds really helps everyone else piece together an understanding for themselves. And please keep doing that.
Thank you for those words, Kelsey. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this recording with us and sharing your journey.
Interview me again in a year and I'll tell you where we've gone.
I think that would be a great follow-up conversation to have. I can't wait to hear what more you uncover in that time. You've uncovered so much in just such a short amount of time after not even knowing who this relative was not so long ago.
I think there's a lot to discover, and there are some sources. We just figured out that he once lived in Amsterdam. We have some more addresses where he lived in Wilhelmshaven. I just discovered what he was doing with the Navy. He was in the construction division, a very small division doing construction work in Wilhelmshaven. So there's still the military files we have to go through. So I think there's a lot to discover. It will be worth to have another interview.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for your diligence, because it's such a link between where my grandfather lived and where you live. Jacob can actually ride his bike by places that he lived or places where he worked.
Thank you again for sharing with us today. It was such a pleasure to hear more about your story and learn more about Max and his life.
Well, I appreciate the knowledge that all three of you bring.
Sachsenhausen, błogosławiony raju, wszak wielbi Ciebie ludzkość, Heil, Sachsenhausen. A jak będę jutro wzdychał lewą nóżką, ci zawtikam. Heil, es lebe Gold, o Kampf.